Hi everyone, this is Andrei Roman. I'm the CEO of AtlasIntel, and I'm welcoming you to the last edition for this US presidential election cycle of Atlas Deep Dive. We will be discussing the latest polling on the presidential race, and joining me, Pedro Azevedo, our head of US coverage.
Hey Andrei, happy to be here. Exciting. Our final episode before the election.
So this is our final episode with analyses of our polling. It is not an analysis of our final poll. We'll probably release one or perhaps two more rounds before election day. This will be both polling at the national level in the swing states, and in some states that you'll be seeing Atlas estimates for the first time. Places like Virginia, Ohio, Texas. We'll also be putting out estimates for Puerto Rico, which has been in the news recently with the whole scandal, right, on the comedian
During the Trump rally.
statements during our Trump rally in New York City.
Yeah.
So, without further ado, let's discuss our latest results. You may be wondering why it's even relevant to look at us discussing this, since I just said that we'll be putting out two more releases. So let me just clarify something before we start. Even though we will be publishing two further rounds of results, we do not think that the estimates will change that much in what we'll publish further. And that's because most US voters have already voted. Once you vote, you pretty much just declare what you voted. So the tendency in these last few days is for the numbers to actually stabilize. The most impactful, I would say, on the estimates is perhaps assumptions that we make about turnout. So that is actually kind of a sample calibration impact. But even with those, I do not believe that we'll see major shifts. So that means that what we're going to be discussing now is pretty much our outlook for the U.S. race. There may be, small adjustments in the numbers, particularly in the state, in some of the swing states, particularly perhaps in the Rust Belt, where turnout is of huge importance. A lot of the votes actually come in on election day. So, if there's any change in our assumptions on turnout on election day, that makes a difference. But the changes that I expect are actually not that big. That means that as you're watching us discuss these numbers today, this is very close to what we think is our final assessment of the US race, even as the estimates are not those of a final poll. And with that being said, let's jump into the data and look at the results. We will be starting with the national level, national popular vote estimates. What do they show us, Pedro?
Well, Andrei, what we see here is maybe a slight decrease for Trump, on the average since our polls in mid-October and in September. But a very slight fluctuation. This is a 1 percentage point shift here, right? On 17 October, we had him at 50.8% of the popular vote. Now we have him at 49.6%. But in general, it's a very stable race, as we've been saying so far, and that's particularly noticeable in Kamala Harris's numbers, where she has been sort of parked around 48% ever since she entered the race. So, like we've been saying, she perhaps is profiting from that enthusiasm from entering the race and, mobilizing the Democratic base. She's doing a lot better than Biden would be doing by now if he had stayed in. But she has perhaps not been able to capitalize much beyond that.
I would highlight here that since the beginning of this election cycle, Atlas has consistently been the only pollster showing a national popular advantage for Trump. This is what this graph says. From July till now, this margin has fluctuated a bit. Actually, it's quite stable, but you've seen, some normal fluctuations. You've seen it tightening a little bit over the past couple of weeks, but we're still essentially projecting an NPV advantage for Trump, which is very significant because if you look at historical patterns and you try to figure out what happens when with the swing states when you have a national popular advantage for the Republican candidate, this should translate into a comfortable win, a blowout in the swing states. That's not exactly what our swing states numbers show, though. So it points to some realignment. It points to a historical realignment, perhaps, if it sticks, where states that have traditionally been very safe for Democrats with huge margins, states like California, New York. I would also point here to states that were swing states and they're not anymore, like Ohio or Florida, and now perhaps Nevada. These are large electoral colleges that perhaps don't mean that much for whoever wins this election cycle, perhaps with the exception of Nevada. But in terms of their weight in the national popular vote, well, that's really significant. So the reason for which Trump is doing this well here is not really because of the swing states, in our opinion. It's more because of these Dem strongholds, where the margins for the Dems have worsened significantly over time. Now, why is it the case that we're seeing this tighten over the last couple of weeks? Well, you have, I think, some late catch up for Kamala Harris and her stronger demographics. So, the Black vote, the Latino vote, the margins had really worsened in this cycle. But what tends to happen in the last phase of a presidential race is that some of these voters think about their options, analyze the race, and they tend to stick with their groups. So my expectation here is that some of the voters that were Latinos or Blacks that were considering voting for Trump may actually change their minds, vote for Kamala Harris, or perhaps not vote. And when you have something like the Puerto Rico scandal, that really, I think, tends to affect the Latino vote across the board. I think the way the Trump campaign has managed that wasn't particularly good. They had the big advantage or luck that Biden came with a terrible statement and provided Trump with the opportunity of, capitalizing on that. But the way Trump capitalized on it is, helps him with the white vote. It doesn't really help him with the Latino or the Black vote. So with that being said, I think these numbers, like a slight tightening of the tendency between Trump and Harris, makes quite a bit of sense.
And this has been, just so you mentioned how Trump fought back, we'll say, against the scandal about the comedian and his comments on Puerto Rico. That has been sort of the story of the Trump campaign so far, where they've been trying to reach out to Black and Latino voters, but they seem to always end up coming back to their more traditional base. And so I think what we're seeing here, and even this lead here, is a lot of people are dissatisfied with the Biden administration, and Kamala perhaps hasn't been able to distance herself from that. And so some people here are leaning for Trump. But in terms of the campaign message, we've seen that time and again where Trump sort of keeps coming back to this base, right? Into this idea, more to his more traditional base than this consistent, maybe reaching out to Black and Latino voters.
At the end of the day, what really makes a difference in the swing states, what will really make a difference on Tuesday, in my opinion, in a place like Pennsylvania, will Puerto Ricans there be important? Of course. But even more so, it will be the white turnout mobilization. So, if white males really turn out for Trump on Tuesday, he can carry out Pennsylvania. And I think, the whole garbage truck scene and whatever we're seeing in terms of efforts to mobilize voters in this phase of the campaign, it kind of makes sense. From a strategic perspective, this is what he needs. He needs to mobilize voters on election day in the Rust Belt states. This is what will make the difference between him winning or losing this presidential election. So let's also look at our full scenario, because we're talking about margins for the NPV. This is one of the figures that will attract most attention when final results are tallied, and it's important to note that it makes a difference whether you look at a head-to-head scenario or at the full scenario, where the best performing candidate, Jill Stein at 1%, mostly takes votes away from Kamala Harris and not from Trump, right? So with that being said, when we're looking at the full scenario, there's a difference there. So the advantage for Trump varies between 1.9 when we're looking at the full scenario, which is this one you're seeing here, and I think 1.4 in the other scenario. What would you comment on this Jill Stein performance here, Pedro? And do you think, is there any swing state in particular where you'd look for Jill Stein perhaps making the difference between Kamala Harris winning or losing that state?
Yeah, I would point out that the difference here between the head-to-head scenario and the full scenario for Harris is exactly 1 percentage point, right? So that's how many votes Jill Stein has. And of course, we can't say that every single Jill Stein voter would vote for Kamala Harris if Jill Stein wasn't in the race.
But the suggestion is very strong.
These are very small numbers, and we have to be very cautious when dealing with this. But the Green Party supporters will typically be more left-leaning, so we can say that these people either wouldn't vote at all or would vote for Kamala Harris if they were made to. While we don't see that same, for Trump, we have a difference of just 0.5 percentage point, and we have that around, people who don't intend to vote, or people who are, Chase Oliver only has 0.2 percentage points. So maybe the people who are voting for Trump are people who aren't really who weren't going to turn out for anyone else, right? While people are going to come out and vote for Jill Stein, that could maybe be coming out and voting for Kamala Harris. And so, exactly like you said, I think she'll be receiving a lot of attention after the election, especially if Harris loses by a small margin in places like Michigan, for example, where the Green Party is, especially popular with a certain kind of left-leaning progressive voter, the same voters that are concerned about the Biden administration's positions toward Gaza. So I would especially point out Michigan, which is a very tight margin right now, and where I suspect Jill Stein would be, especially popular.
And within the Arab American vote, I would assume. It will be interesting to look at this in cities in Michigan where, for example, Trump was endorsed by an Arab American mayor. I'm actually quite curious as to what will happen with Jill Stein's vote in Michigan and if the difference between Trump and Harris, if Trump wins, is actually smaller than Jill Stein's vote. And if Trump gets elected because of that, Jill Stein will probably become one of the most hated people in America, at least when it comes to Democrats. Okay, so let's move forward and look at our swing state polling. And here you see our map. We have very tight margins in Wisconsin and Michigan. And with the exception of those, even as the margin in Pennsylvania has tightened a bit, even as the margin in Georgia is not that big, or in Nevada, not that great, we think that these are lean Republican states. This is kind of consistent with what we've seen so far in AtlasIntel polling. We may be right, we may be wrong, but I think this is kind of honest to the numbers that we have been putting out. It's important to note some changes on the map. North Carolina, we'll talk about it very soon, and Nevada. So if there's any places where I think the Republican vote has really strengthened, I would also point out to Arizona, actually. So in Nevada, Arizona, and North Carolina, in AtlasIntel estimates, the Republicans have improved quite a bit in in the polling that we're analyzing right now. In Pennsylvania and Michigan, the margins have tightened a bit, and well, Wisconsin has always been very tight, and we expect it
tough
to be
one.
tight on election day.
Well,
So
what I
let's
would point out here in this electoral map is that, you know, among the states that we're considering that lean more to Republicans, Pennsylvania is the one with the tightest margin. But if this is the map, if the Sunbelt states all swing for Trump, Harris could win Pennsylvania and she could still lose the Electoral College if she loses in Wisconsin or Michigan, where the margins are also very tight. So this map, if we have, you know, solid margins in the Sunbelt states, what happens here is that, you know, even if Harris does end up winning Pennsylvania, she's still not home free because she would have to take all three Rust Belt states here, right? So this is why we're seeing a bit of an advantage for Trump now, because he has put, with these numbers, he has put Kamala Harris in a situation where she would have to win all three Rust Belt states, which, as we've said, are very, very tight margins right now.
If there is one surprise I would be looking at outside of the Rust Belt, I would be looking at Georgia. Georgia has provided us with surprises in the last few cycles. And it could do so again. It's a state where the changing demographics have favored Democrats. Polling has been consistently showing Trump ahead this time around, but there's always the potential for systematic polling bias. And so if there's any place in particular that could provide a positive surprise for Kamala Harris, you know, besides the obvious places like the Rust Belt states, I would be looking at Georgia. That being said, let's dig into the state-by-state numbers, and we'll start with North Carolina.
All right,
What do
let's get
our
into
numbers
it.
show there, Pedro? So this is just to provide an overview of the sample sizes as well. This was a sample collected on the 30th and 31st of November, 1,373 respondents. We're looking at the time series here, and as you can see, there is a change. Trump is now ahead, 50.7 to 47%. And I will make a few comments actually here before I let you, Pedro. We have taken a very hard look at our sampling in North Carolina. And we now think that the issue here, or perhaps the reason for which Trump is now leading but wasn't before, has to do with the way we are modeling turnout, in particular for some areas of the state that were the most affected by the hurricane that just, that just had devastating consequences on Western North Carolina. So, turnout is a major element to how you model these margins when they're tight. Essentially, everything here in this time series, even as you're looking at these changes, everything is within the margin of error of this poll. Okay, from the beginning till the end. We're not talking about huge swings, but the assumptions we make are very important. And in particular, I would say that an element that has changed in this last set of results is the way we are modeling turnout, in particular among younger Republican voters that appear to be more demobilized than they are in the last estimate. So essentially, this is what has happened with our numbers in North Carolina. Um, we will probably be putting out one or two more estimates for the state and all the other swing states before Election Day. So we'll see if this sticks. But as I was saying, I would expect it to. This is already a moment where most of voters in North Carolina have probably already cast a ballot. So there's not really a major reason for this to shift. Now, it's important to note here in the gubernatorial race, this is not, we're not going to be talking about all the Senate estimates in this deep dive because we've kind of covered them before. We kind of know that they're tight and all of that. But we see Mark Robinson improving a bit here. We're still, though, kind of poised for a Josh Stein victory by a very, very large margin for a state with the profile of North Carolina. I mean, the current governor, Roy Cooper, very popular governor.
Very well regarded.
His first election, his margin, I think, was less than 0.5, his margin of victory. So for Josh Stein to be ahead by 10 points or even more, that kind of points to just how different this gubernatorial race is from the presidential race. It may also be the case that this was one of the reasons for which our polling was showing Trump behind. So it may be the case that, the Mark Robinson scandal really did make a huge impression on voters in North Carolina, that Republican voters were dissatisfied with their options for the gubernatorial race, that in some way they were perhaps even considering not voting for Trump because of this. But at the end of the day, the structural vote, that identity of belonging to your political group speaks stronger. So even as you're not happy at all about Mark Robinson and the state of the Republican Party in the state of North Carolina, I think there is a last-minute consolidation of the Republican vote, at least in the presidential race. And what you're seeing here is actually even in the gubernatorial race. So Mark Robinson is not
tightening there, right?
He's not
slight increase.
He's
for Robinson.
not collapsing right now. He's improving a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, North Carolina is usually, in the last two presidential races, at least the reddest of the swing states. So it's a, traditionally, strong Republican state. So I think we're seeing that structural advantage come in here a bit in the last moment, in the final week, we're seeing that mobilization maybe pay off a bit.
And it's important to note also that, we're talking about a major red swing at the national popular vote. And we're talking about many swing states that have become red, Ohio and Florida. And now we're seeing an advantage in Nevada. For Trump to be leading in North Carolina and Nevada with similar margins, it's because North Carolina is doing worse, relative to the average for Republicans in the cycle. So I guess the structural advantage of the party here is, at the end of the day, the most decisive factor. Let's talk about Georgia. A sample of 1,212 respondents, same data collection dates, 3 percentage points margin of error. Seeing a tighter result here, 48.8% for Trump, 47.2% for Kamala Harris. That's a 1.6 percentage point advantage. Tight. Joel Stein at 2%. Then if we're looking at the head-to-head, you're actually seeing a tightening there as well, 50.1 to 47.8. Could there be a surprise in Georgia? Pedro, what do you think?
Oh, definitely. Well, we had a surprise in Georgia in 2020, right? I think that was the most Georgia flipping blue for Biden. That was
That was a
That
shock.
was a shock for most of the people that were following this. And I think what we're seeing here is to be expected. It's a very, even more so than North Carolina, Georgia is a very traditionally strong Republican state. They have a strong local Republican Party. The governor, Brian Kemp, very popular. So a very strong ground operation. So I think it's right here to expect that Trump would have an advantage and that this margin would be, would be favorable to him. But if the Democrats can pull off the same kind of turnout and mobilization strategy that we've seen in 2020 and we've seen in the Senate elections as well and the runoffs for they managed to flip the election from John Ossoff was slightly behind was Purdue in the first, and then they had the runoff and John Ossoff actually won. So Democrats have also been very competent at mobilization in Georgia, and this is one that I would say would come down to turnout. This is a very tight margin here. It's
So
within our
far,
margin of
so
error.
far, what
But
we're seeing in the early voting data in terms when it comes to turnout by race is that blacks in this cycle appear to be voting less, or that the black vote has weakened as a component of the early vote. I mean, of course, that can change on election day, and we know that Republicans are voting much more in the early vote this cycle. And we know also that the Republican vote in Georgia is more white than the average. So it may be the case that there's just kind of a change in the pattern of how people turn out to vote, and not any sort of structural advantage that can be derived from that early voting data. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's there's reasons to suspect that the black vote could be worsening in Georgia, but there's also reason to be cautious when making that assessment as well, because you still have a few days left, and most importantly, you still have the election day vote. And across the country, I would say that blacks vote more on election day. It's not just so perhaps the same way that we know that Republicans prefer to vote on election day. It's true about blacks that they generally vote Democrat, but relative to Democratic voters, blacks turn out more on election day. So that's an important thing to know about Georgia.
Yeah, that's always something to have in mind when we talk about early voting as well. We can use some of that as indicators of trying to see model turnout and see where the race is going. But it's always something for us and for our listeners to keep in mind that when we talk about early voting, we're not always sure of how well that would be compensated by election day votes. So it's always something we have to exercise some caution
And
about.
that's where the machine politics and the structure of the campaigns, communication during the last stretch of the campaign, all of that makes a difference, right? Something like the Puerto Rico scandal, I think that will impact the Latino vote, in these last few days. So there's every indication that Latinos voted much less in the early vote this cycle. Well, guess what? Perhaps that is actually good news for Kamala Harris, because that means that there are still lots of Latinos left to vote. And as they've been impacted by the negative news on Trump, who knows what will happen on election day with the Latino vote. And that may make a big difference, for example, in Nevada, where the Republicans right
been
now have an
performing very
advantage, but the Latino vote is almost 20% of adult voters there. So if I were, a Republican campaign manager in Nevada, I would be quite worried about the Latino vote right now. That's still left out there. Okay, let's move to Arizona. And here we have a sample of 1,005 respondents, 3 percentage point margin of error, same data collection days. here we're actually looking at a stable, a stable scenario relative to our previous estimates. Very small widening of the margin for Trump, 51 percentage points for Trump versus 46.8% for Kamala Harris in the head-to-head scenario. When we're looking at the full ballot, it's 50.8 for Trump, 45.9 for Harris, 1.1 for Jill Stein, and 0.5 for Chase Oliver. Nevada kind of has a more libertarian bend, so I guess it makes sense to see Chase Oliver outperform here. In most places, he's at 0.1. Here he's at 0.5. Not that would make a huge difference on the race, but no, it kind of makes intuitive sense when I look at this.
Well, yeah, but in 2020, when the election was decided in Arizona by 10,000 votes. I'm pretty sure
that's a great point. The libertarians made the difference there between Trump.
It's like we've been saying about Jill Stein, I think, and that was a point of contention about the Green Party vote in other states. I feel like exactly in Arizona, maybe the voters that would tend toward the Republican Party also captivated by the libertarians, so that's sort of the reverse of that there. So, but of course, with these numbers, if this is the margin, I don't think Chase Oliver will make that much of a difference.
So the most interesting thing to watch in Arizona, in my opinion, given that I think both polling and early vote data indicates that Republicans will likely carry the state for the presidential race, we may have a surprise in the Senate race. Kari Lake is in a very heated situation with Ruben Gallego. She is actually now numerically ahead in this poll. We know that Kari Lake has underperformed, in Arizona relative to the presidential vote. We know that she lost the last gubernatorial race when it seemed that she should be carrying it. So now, whenever you see polling with Kari Lake, everyone says, she's not, she's not gonna win this, right? That's kind of like the intuitive reaction to any Kari Lake polling. But don't discount the possibility of Kari Lake win if the Republican votes in Arizona are coming in at a turnout rate that's way above historical average. That could actually mean by a very tight margin, Kari Lake could win this race. And this is a very important race for the balance of the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Even if we consider, numerically important, right, as she can just tip the Senate to Republicans in general, but, I think the Republican candidate that flips the Senate being Kari Lake would be very different from the Republican candidate flipping the Senate being David McCormick, for example, who is running in Pennsylvania and is a much more moderate, a different kind of Republican. Kari Lake is very committed to the more radical
she's
MAGA
kind of moderated,
sort of policies.
But she's moderated a bit in this cycle, right?
Well, yeah, but she's still holding on to that to those election fraud claims on her own elections. I saw, in fact, some polling the other day that even some Republicans in Arizona who believe that that Trump lost in 2020 because of election fraud
don't like Kari Lake.
Don't believe that Kari Lake lost because of election fraud. They think that only Trump was. So I would say, if this is the margin for Trump at the end, it's possible that he could, carry Lake over the edge here, even if she underperforms him a bit. But my prior would be with such a tight margin that I would still
give it to Ruben.
I still think it would be Gallego here.
Okay, I kind of have the same intuition. Just because Kari Lake always underperforms in polling. But who knows? Maybe there could be a surprise. I think either way, this will be very tight. Okay, if she wins or loses, this will be decided by a very, very, very tight margin.
Which is something that's very hard to, predict in polling due to our margin of errors. And, we have to,
Yeah.
it's good to remind everyone that, on your earlier poll, you said Ruben Gallego was winning, and now you're saying Carrie Lake is winning. I mean, this is,
Yeah.
it was Ruben Gallego by a margin of 0.5 percentage points, and now it's Carrie
Yeah.
Lake by a margin of 0.7. That's, from a polling standpoint, it's virtually the same. We're telling you that the race is
It's
tied,
very tight.
pretty much.
That's right. Let's move over to Nevada. Here we have a smaller sample, 845 respondents, still a margin of error of 3 percentage points. And here we're looking at an increasing Trump advantage. 50.6% for Trump to 47% for Kamala Harris in the head-to-head scenario. That is a considerable margin of 3.6 percentage points. That is the single best number for Trump in Nevada since we started this polling back in September. Looking good for Trump in Nevada.
Yeah, I mean, what we've been seeing in Nevada, especially, now that the early votes are coming in, and Nevada is a state where most of the vote comes in early or by mail. So because of these characteristics, we've been seeing, I think, especially Democrats very worried about Nevada, because this is the first election cycle where we're seeing at this point on the early voting with Republicans being ahead, right? And being ahead by a margin of around, 5 percentage points, which is a considerable margin for the Democrats to make up on election day. Like we've been saying, maybe there are some more, Latino voters that will swing to Democrats on election day. It's not completely out of their hands, but from what we're seeing here, I think that it would be safe to say that Trump has a strong margin in Nevada.
What I find it amazing here is that, and you look at the Latino vote, and it's tied between Trump and Harris. That is quite something. The black vote also surprisingly high for Trump here. The margins of error for these groups are way higher, particularly for the black voters that are a very tiny percentage of the electorate in a place like Nevada. But what this tells me is, if you're waiting for the Latinos to save Kamala on election day, because Latinos do vote more on election day, well, guess what? You'd need a much better margin than this. Actually, you don't have a margin and these crosstabs for that to happen. So unless the Latinos that vote on election day are really mobilized by the whole Puerto Rico scandal, or somehow there's the Dem machine really pushing Latinos to vote on election day, I don't really see how Kamala Harris can shift this back to her advantage. And this is
Yeah,
a major change on the map, right? Compared to the last election cycles, this is perhaps the Florida moment for Nevada. It's a time when you think, wow, if this is gonna happen by these margins in this cycle, then perhaps going forward, the future for Nevada is what we're seeing right now for Florida. I mean, probably Trump will carry Florida by a margin of more than 10 percentage points in the cycle.
Yeah, I would point out what we've already said in other episodes, I think, talking about Nevada and Arizona, that this really highlights, I think, the differences within, Hispanic voters, Latino voters, which, we group them demographically to make it easier for, analysis. But, of course, the Latino voters in Pennsylvania, for example, there's a very strong Puerto Rican community.
Yeah.
In Nevada and Arizona, that's not exactly the case. These are, people from other origins. And so this might be, a very interesting difference to highlight here, because the remarks at the Trump rally in Madison Square Garden, they had a huge repercussion within the Puerto Rican community, and of course that spills out a bit into Latinos more generally. But it was very, since the remarks were especially about Puerto Rico, that's perhaps where they're more concentrated, and perhaps Latino voters in Nevada and Arizona aren't as mobilized by this as maybe Pennsylvanian Latino voters would be. And I would also point out that, considering the large margin of error within our crosstabs, we see that independents are also sort of basically tied here. I would say that, Trump is slightly ahead, but, with our big margins of error here, we could say that they're sort of tied. And that's really important, because what we've been talking about with the early voting data is we know the party affiliation of the people that voted, right? We don't know yet who they voted for. Those votes haven't been counted. But, with the margins for Republicans here, Democrats would need a considerable margin within independents to overcome the Republican advantage that's forming. And that's not what we're seeing here in our numbers, right? So again, if these are the numbers, then like you said, it's possible that we're looking at a larger than expected Republican victory in Nevada.
And if that is true, what about the Senate race there? We have a difference between Jackie Rosen and Sam Brown of just 2 points. My hunch about all of these Senate races is that they tend to underestimate ticket splitting, okay? Why that happens to polls or our polls versus election results is anyone's guess. But my hunch is that whenever we see, an inverse result from the most important race, which is the presidential race, that we should give a bonus to whoever managed that switch in the Senate race. So I actually think that, relative to our polling here, Jackie Rosen is actually a bit better, and her margin will probably be a bit better than this. But I may be wrong, and that margin in the polling is tightening. And so based on this, even thinking that she may outperform Kamala Harris by more than what this poll reveals, if Trump does better in the presidential race than we're showing here, then at the limit you could have a very tight Sam Brown victory as well, and that is very consequential.
We were just talking about the coattails maybe helping Carrie Lake up, since she's not a very good candidate, but she's riding the Trump coattails. We could see the same thing here with Sam Brown, who was Republicans were very excited about him, but he hasn't run a great campaign so far, and Republicans were maybe counting him out. But, like you said, if that's the margin for Trump in Nevada, maybe we see him pulling Sam Brown up, by the coattails as well. So that's definitely possible here. But, so far we're still seeing, Jackie Rosen has led the race, for all of our polling so far. And I'd still say that she has an advantage here.
I agree. I would give her maybe a 70% chance of winning this race. Still 30% is something to look for. It means that Sam Brown still has a shot. Wisconsin. Should I say that this is my favorite state to poll? 673 respondents, 4 percentage point margin of error. I was joking about it being my favorite state to poll. It is not my favorite.
Probably the least favorite state.
So the thing about Wisconsin is that it's crazy difficult to poll it, because it's so small, and because everyone wants to know what the voters there are going to do. And because it is small and there's so much polling, people hate pollsters and polls, and they don't want to answer any more poll. Okay, so the response rates are low. It's very
And it's also
hard to.
particularly difficult to
Yeah.
model turnout there, right?
Oh yeah, it's like New Hampshire. New Hampshire is perhaps worse, but Wisconsin is also really bad in terms of that. So, well, we're doing our best to try to come up with accurate results for Wisconsin. This is what we have now. You're looking at a very tight race between Kamala and Trump. 0.2% advantage for Kamala in the head-to-head scenario, but guess what? If you're looking at the extended ballot, Trump's ahead by 0.3, 48.5 to 48.2, and that's because Jill Stein has 0.8. So in a place like Wisconsin, the Jill Stein votes and Chase Oliver votes and whoever else is on that ballot that I don't remember, that may make a difference. Now, does this automatically mean that we're going to have a very tight result in Wisconsin? Don't bet on it. Don't bet on it. And that's why do I think that could be the case? Because of turnout. So if there's any indication from what we're seeing in the early votes in Nevada or in Pennsylvania, is that perhaps Republicans may be much more energized this time around. And so if they are much more energized, even as the structural characteristics of the voters and their actual preferences point to a very tight result, if turnout mobilization is way heavier for Trump voters, that means that he could win this by a larger margin. So let me rephrase this. I think what we have in Wisconsin can go from either a very tight Kamala Harris victory, like we're showing here in the head-to-head scenario, or to a margin for Trump that can be as high as +2. That is my perspective on Wisconsin at this point in time.
Yeah, reminding everyone here that Biden won Wisconsin by 0.6 percentage points. That's 20,000 votes, so that's a tiny margin for flipping it. And, even in 2016, Trump didn't flip it by a very large margin as well. So
the margins are always very tight.
So in these the base scenarios without accounting for, the increased Republican enthusiasm that we could be seeing here, it's a very tight race. But, like you said, we could go from a very tight race to perhaps a stronger Trump performance than expected.
You also have a Senate race here that's also expected to be very close, with a higher chance of Tammy Baldwin winning, in my opinion. Once again, I think here she probably will be outperforming Kamala Harris, perhaps by a bit more than what this poll reveals. That being said, let's move over to Michigan, which is one of the most important states for Kamala Harris, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
It's consistently a place where polls show her ahead. Not Atlas polls, but all other polls. It's a place where Democrats have been doing great in the past 2 cycles, the midterms and the last presidential election. So if there's any place that it's make it or break it for Kamala Harris besides Pennsylvania, well, guess what? It's Michigan. If she loses Michigan, it's very hard to figure out how she's going to win this presidential race. Mm-hmm. So this was a poll with 1,136 respondents, 3 percentage point margin of error. In our numbers, Trump is still ahead, but by a tight margin, much tighter than when we started polling this in September. So you're seeing Kamala at 48.7, Trump at 49.3. Why is this happening in our numbers? I think it has to do with the black vote, mostly. I think it has to do with, the huge appeals. The Obamas trying to really target black voters and tell them that you have to come out and vote for Kamala Harris. Traditionally, in polls, black voters tend to report undecided rates that are above other racial groups, and that tends to tighten in the last few days of a campaign, and it tends to tighten even more on election day. So some of those that were declaring themselves undecided actually come out to vote, and they vote with the majority of the black vote. So that means that you could have a Kamala Harris victory in Michigan based on the tendencies that we're presenting here. If it happens or if it doesn't happen, I think this is going to be for sure one of the tightest states. Based on the dynamics we're seeing in this data.
Yeah,
It makes a difference, though.
Like you mentioned, Democrats have been doing really well here, even in 2016, when of course Trump flipped these three states, right? Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Michigan was the one that flipped to him by the
Tiniest.
smallest margin. So
Yeah.
this really is, one of the places where the Democrats are stronger. And like you said, if she loses Michigan, that's probably, I mean, even not just mathematically, but it's just probably a bad sign for the Democratic operation elsewhere.
Yeah.
And yeah, essentially what we're seeing here with this tightening margin, and like you said, with increased black vote, perhaps. What we're seeing here is kind of like what we're seeing in Georgia and North Carolina for the Republicans, where, Georgia and North Carolina are traditionally Republican states and with a strong Republican Party local operation. That's likely also behind what we're seeing here in Michigan. We have a strong Democratic Party with a popular governor.
The structural impact, just
and
like
so-
North Carolina is picking up speed for Republicans at the very end.
Yeah.
Michigan is picking up speed for Democrats at the very end. And Georgia is that place where kind of like the two machines are now kind of in a tie.
Yeah,
Because the
battling for
Democrats,
dominance.
the Democrats have gotten so much stronger there. So that's really a place where it's two very relevant giants battling each other. In Michigan, the Dem machine is still way stronger. In North Carolina, the Republican machine is still way stronger. So yeah, if Kamala loses Michigan, I think it's pretty safe to say that she will lose this election. This is perhaps the most important bellwether state when it comes to the swing states in this cycle. And look at Jill Stein here, 1.7%. So that's a way better result for Jill Stein than her average in other swing states and at the national level. That could decide the election in Michigan. It could even decide the presidential election if you think about it that way.
Yeah, like we were saying at the beginning, Michigan is, like we were saying, it's a place with a very strong local Democratic Party, but it's also a place with certain demographic groups that are particularly upset at the Democrats and especially at the Biden administration because of the Gaza policy. So that's Arab Americans, but that's also a very a young population, college students, where that specific progressive leaning and that concern about the conditions in Gaza is very strong. And so that perfectly explains, I think, why Jill Stein is performing so well here as sort of a protest vote even. And, like we were saying also, not necessarily all of these 1.7% of voters that are voting for Jill Stein would swing for Kamala Harris. But if the margin is as tight as we're seeing here, as a 0.9 percentage points, then it's safe to assume that if Jill Stein were not in the race, that this could perhaps have a safer margin for Kamala Harris.
For sure.
And so, this is definitely going to be a very strong contention point here if Donald Trump ends up winning Michigan, is what would happen if Jill Stein had dropped out and had endorsed Harris or whatever. Which, in fact, is also, recently the Green parties in Europe, a lot of them sent a manifesto, sort of a letter to Jill Stein, asking her to drop out and to endorse Harris. which is, of course, it's not going to happen. It's especially at this point in the race. But in
Yeah.
general, the Green Party and the Libertarian Party as well, they run sort of more
And
on principle than on pragmatic
a
policy.
movement
So,
among Arab Americans to support Jill Stein in this race in Michigan, right?
well, yeah, like I said, a protest vote against
A
the
protest vote,
Democratic, the Biden administration's
but it's being
policies.
mobilized, right? So it's not just as like that it's an individual protest vote. Oh, usually when we think about a protest vote, it's the voter rebels by himself.
Yeah.
In this case, it's a protest vote that certain agents are stimulating.
Yeah, an actual movement. Yeah, I mean it's the same. We saw this already in the primaries, right, where we saw a strong movement for voters to sort of protest Biden by voting uncommitted, or you had this option on the
Yeah.
ballot in some states, and this was particularly strong here. So I think it's carrying
It was
over
strong
from
in
that
Michigan?
from that same
Yeah.
same movement.
It was
that same
stronger in
wave.
Michigan and in other places, right?
Yeah. This was a particularly, this was basically the only point in the Democratic primary where we were saying, oh, okay, this is
Yeah.
a problem for Biden.
Yeah. So there's a red flag there. Okay. And in the Senate race in Michigan, we have Alyssa Slotkin improving her margins finally against Mike Rogers. Now she's 3 percentage points ahead. I expect her to win this by a larger advantage. Okay, so maybe look at 5 or 6 when these votes are tallied. Pennsylvania, the single most important prize on Tuesday. This was a poll with 1,738 respondents. It's the only poll with a 2 percentage point margin of error. And here, a little bit of a tightening between Trump and Harris. 49.4 for Trump to 47.9 for Kamala Harris. It kind of begs the question as to the Puerto Rican vote and if that's in any way behind this. It could be. And then if we're looking at the extended scenario, 48.5 for Trump, 47.4 for Kamala Harris, Jill Stein at 1%, and Chase Oliver at 0.5. Undecided at 2.3. That's a large percentage figure, considering that this is a likely voter concept. So, yeah, that's kind of the moment when, as a pollster, you look at this and you're like,
well, what the hell?
yeah. So hopefully they don't all break for one side or the other. Hopefully they'll divide themselves evenly on the day of the vote. Look, this is all gonna come down to turnout in Pennsylvania. What I would point out here is that compared to the last presidential election, the Trump campaign has done a very different job at mobilizing voters here. I mean, they've done everything. They have Elon Musk giving out money to people to register. They have registered voters like crazy. They've outpaced registrations for Democrats in recent weeks. The early vote has shifted in favor of the Republicans. So I would say that the Trump camp will improve a lot based on the numbers that they had in the last presidential election. The question is whether it will be enough, right, to surpass Kamala Harris. And the main outstanding doubt here is what happens to those voters that were part of the firewall, of the Dem firewall, 4 years ago and have not yet voted. The difference is very large. The Dem firewall in 2020 was above 1 million votes. I think it was 1.1 million. And now it stands at below 500,000. So we're talking about at least 500,000 Dem voters that have not yet cast a ballot, that could do so on election day and carry the election in Pennsylvania for Kamala Harris, or fail to show up at least part of them. So that is the doubt here. What will happen to these voters? Will they all mobilize? Won't they? What will be the specific margin that they will mobilize at on election day? What do you think, Pedro?
I would point out here, Andrei, that I mean these are again very tiny samples, so the margin of error may be off. But from looking at the crosstabs, most of the people that answered here that they were undecided, they're mostly men. They're mostly from rural areas, and they are many of them voters that didn't vote in 2020. So I would point out that maybe that's good for Trump, that these are voters that would statistically be more likely to vote for him. But I would also actually point out the other way, which is if you're 4 days away from the election, you're saying you're undecided. Is this a voter that's really going to turn out for Trump at the end, or is it this a voter that's just going to I don't care enough to come out, right?
Yeah.
So I would say that's actually, I would say that those are some potential Trump voters that could pad up his margins here. But I would be very worried if I was the Trump campaign that these, and again, a very small part of the electorate, but we're talking about probably very tight margins here. I would be worried that these are the voters that are still saying they're uncommitted by now, when so close to the race. And if you haven't been able to mobilize them so far, are you going to be able to get them there on election day? So that's a good question there. And I would also point out again, like we've been saying, we talked about the Puerto Rico scandal. Pennsylvania, out of the swing states, is the one with the largest Puerto Rican population. So that could, that made waves, within the Puerto Rican community. So we still have to see if that's going to translate into increased turnout, into better margins for Harris. But it could be something to watch for here in Pennsylvania.
And if it does happen that Kamala wins Pennsylvania by a very, very narrow margin, you can probably assume that it was because of the Puerto Ricans at this point. So,
and then instead of the Democrats hating Jill Stein forever, we'll have the Republicans hating
wanting to
what's the comedian's name? I'm not going to remember his name. Hating the comedian forever,
or wanting to expel Puerto Rico from its territory status.
Yeah,
I don't know what's likelier.
His recent policies.
Okay, well, this is about it. We have the Senate race here. Bob Casey ahead of David McCormick by an increasing margin. So I think it's probably safe to assume that Bob Casey will carry that Senate race in Pennsylvania for the Democrats. And with that being said,
should we get back to the map for our forecast, our probabilities?
Yeah,
the most awaited part.
Let's go back.
So,
what's your likelihood, Pedro? Before I tell you mine.
Oh, the most dreaded question to listen from your boss. Well, I would say we had it, in our last episode, we had it at 60-40, right, for Trump. And I would say that with this map that we're looking at here, that it could go to 70-30, because like we were saying at the beginning, of our episode, basically, if this is the map, if Trump carries all the Sunbelt states in the South, then Harris has to win in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, and Wisconsin. And if she loses any of those, then it's game over for her.
Yeah.
And like we said, Wisconsin is going to probably be very tight margins, and possibly, there's some enthusiasm
they're all very
Trump
tight
voters there that could push that over the edge. So it's a very
they're all very
delicate
tight,
situation for Kamala.
but if you think about it statistically, I mean, they're all very tight. But if you think about it from a sort of a statistical probability perspective, Trump only needs one. He needs 1 out of 3. Whereas Kamala needs 3 out of 3. So based on that, I mean, if we're honest with probability-based thinking here, I think 70-30 is a very reasonable perspective on the likelihoods for winning this presidential race. So,
and I mean, we talked about the possibility of maybe an upset in Georgia, and then if she wins in Georgia, that could offset maybe losing Michigan or losing Wisconsin, or if she wins Pennsylvania, then she wouldn't have. But these are, from our numbers, these are less likely scenarios, right? What we have here is the most likely
and you
scenario
always have
where
the
we would have
possibility.
Harris
I mean, if
having to win all 3 of the Rust Belt states.
If you're thinking about that kind of like tail end scenario, you could have a tail end scenario where Trump manages to get a state that's not on our radar. Like maybe Virginia or Minnesota. Who knows? Probably not Minnesota. Probably not Virginia. But you never know.
Yeah.
So I think this is it, Pedro.
Okay. That's our forecast.
Come down a long way. I have to confess that I am quite tense about getting it right and our estimates being close here. What can I can assure though that to everyone that's watching is that if we're not close, it's not because we didn't try or we didn't work hard enough. This was a lot of hard work over the past few weeks. I'd like to thank our team at AtlasIntel. Thank you, Pedro, for all the work you put into this.
Yeah, thank you, Andrei.
And now it's
been a wild ride.
Now it's just, I guess, putting out the last 2 releases. As I was saying, we'll still have 2 besides this. And then waiting to see what happens on Election Day. Thank you all. Good luck, regardless of what your political sympathy is. Go out to vote. Get all your friends out to vote. Good luck, everyone. And thank you for watching Atlas Deep Dive.